John, thank you for inviting me. Let me begin by saying that I would like to convey my very best wishes to the book club. I think it is absolutely essential with every branch of knowledge. It is essential to realize that you have to ask questions, that you have to question existing knowledge. And unless you question the existing knowledge, you cannot go any further. And therefore, it's terribly important to make critical inquiries, by which I do not mean abusive inquiries. I mean well-read, well-thought, critical inquiries, which you can discuss with other people. And this is very, very important in the whole process of acquiring knowledge in any branch of knowledge, whether it be the sciences or the social sciences or the humanities. The question, the emphasis on critical questioning is extremely important. And I'm glad, therefore, that in a way I've had this opportunity to make this statement, because it's been very much the kind of thing that I have been concerned with in a lot of the work that I have done. Now, to turn to the book under discussion, I was just saying my apologies. I cannot wait for the discussion because I have something else coming up, but I will spend a quarter of an hour just giving you a rough background of what the issues were that were important to me when I was writing the book. First of all, the question of dissent. My generation, at least, of students was brought up to believe that there was absolutely no dissent in the Indian past. Everybody agreed with everybody, and it moved seamlessly from one point to the next. Then, as one researched, and one did a lot of research on ideas and thoughts and representations and so on, one realized that there were dissenting voices, very interesting dissenting voices, which contributed, as it were, to the focus of whatever it was that one was studying. For example, you cannot study civilization without going into the whole question of, did everybody agree with this, or were there some people who didn't agree? And was there a debate? And if there was a debate, what was the end result and what came out of that debate, which might have pushed the idea of civilization a little further in the directions that we are familiar with? So I begin in this book with a brief attempt to talk about the meaning of dissent. Dissent can be something as simple as a difference of opinion. It can be disagreement. What do you like eating for breakfast? And the other person will say, no, I don't like eating that. I like eating something else. This is disagreement. Or it's a difference of opinion. The point about dissent is that it has to be on some substantive issue, nothing that is just casual or marginal or something. It has to be an important issue, important either to the person's life and the kind of creativity that person is indulging in, or important to that person's thinking, or important to society as a whole. But there has to be a substantial issue. Secondly, it must have an objective. It's not just that I disagree with you, full stop, but I disagree with you because, and my disagreement and your position can result in the following situation. So there is an objective and a concern with which you are making that disagreement or expressing that difference. This is a very important basic issue in defining dissent. The second, which I think is also very important, is that dissent has to be distinguished from protest. Protest is much more specific and much more organized. I may have a dissenting discussion with you about a particular theory that I hold, but when it becomes much more pointed, what is the theory about and what is the expected area in which the discussion is going on, If you disagree strongly with the person who makes the first statement, then that is sometimes takes on the nature of protest. But protest usually is not singular. It's not one person who does the protesting. It's usually a group of people. And the third important component of dissent is that it is non-violent. Dissent never, in fact, invokes violence, because when it invokes violence, it ceases to be dissent. It becomes protest, revolt, rebellion. You can call it what you will. But these are three characteristics which I at least would suggest that you keep in mind if you're going to talk about something as dissent. The next question is that why is dissent found in many societies and is important to a large range of societies? We may not say that straightforwardly, we may not recognize it immediately, but when you start thinking about how societies function, what decisions they take, how they organize themselves, then you do come up against some people who have different dissenting ideas about that. So dissent is an important factor in societies. And it becomes even more so in what we call complex societies, societies which have cross-sections of different social categories. For example, a society that has, like Indian society has been really from about the 5th century BC onwards, where you have groups of pastoralists, you have groups of agriculturalists, you have urbanites, and you have a kind of mixture of patterns of living. Because when you mix your patterns of living, then it's more likely that someone will come up and say, why are we doing it this way? Why don't we do it that way? And then there's a little debate and a little dissent on that pattern of living. So the multiple patterns of living will give you more occasions where people will ask questions about why is something being done in a particular way. And then again, societies that have experienced what we call civilization, that is a fairly advanced state of urban living in which there is a very high level of literature, philosophy, architecture, thought, science, medicine, and so on. And where the society is really opening itself up to all kinds of knowledge and using that knowledge to make advances. That is very important. And there, for example, there will be many questions that seem to be questions of dissent. And what I would like to argue is that in the sheer advance of knowledge, and this is particularly comes through very clearly in the sciences and should be recognized equally much in the social sciences and the humanities, that the advance of knowledge cannot take place without questioning existing knowledge. If you're perfectly happy with what is going on in the world around you, you have no questions at all, you become a comfortable, static human being. But if you begin to say, I wonder why it's like this, would it be better if it was like that? This little comparative thing that comes in about, can we improve our existing situation? Whatever definition you may give to improvement, which definition should be agreed upon by most of the people that you're living with. I mean, you can't argue that if I kill somebody, I'm improving my position and expect people to accept you. But you have to be very careful about what you are arguing that you want to change. Now, if that is the case and that you have people around you with whom you're discussing how you can improve your pattern of living and advance knowledge, this is absolutely crucial to every aspect of the advance of knowledge, irrespective of whether you're doing history or you're doing physics, or even if you're doing yoga. It's something that is absolutely basic. And do remember that where dissent has a very high position, a very high status, is precisely in philosophy. You cannot have philosophical schools and you cannot have philosophical discussion unless there are people who are around and who say, sorry, I don't quite agree with that. And then you explain, that the person explains why they don't agree, and you answer. And so this debate begins, and this is crucial to philosophical schools. If you in fact study the history of philosophy, this is what you will be always taught. And in ancient India, there was a method which describes this. There was what was called the Purva Paksha, the opinion of the opponent. I don't agree with X's ideas. I begin my discussion by saying, this is what X says. And you give as exact and honest a summary of X's point of view. That is your Purva Paksha. Then you give your own point of view if you're opposing X, and that is called the Pratipaksha. You're opposing, you're against it. So immediately a debate comes up. There's the view of the Purva Paksha and the view of the Pratipaksha. And we're told in philosophical circles that when these two views are counteracting, are countering each other, they may emerge out of this encounter what is called the Siddhartha, the message, the solution, the eventual outcome. Or you may end up by saying, sorry, the disagreement is too large, we cannot find any kind of outcome out of the debate. But that is something that, we should also always remember, that in all philosophical schools, whether it is Socrates, whether it is Karl Marx, whether it is the Indian philosophical schools, this question, answer, and discussion is a fundamental method. Some people refer to it as a kind of dialectical method, though, of course, the dialectical method emerges much later on in history. But it is present in virtually every school of philosophical thought. So we as historians should sort of take over that method and see the extent to which we might be able to apply it in historical research. And civilization, as I said earlier, is not something vague up there which, exists by itself. It is created. It is constantly created. There's a continuous process in which questions are being asked, answers are being given, and there are advances of thinking being applied to something like technology or just the general sociology, the general way of living, and so on. Now, dissent is also seen perhaps a little more clearly, not just in philosophical schools, but also in the history of every religion. And one may ask why. This is again something which is never really stressed when we are taught religion. Of course, we are very seldom taught the history of religion. We are taught what a religion says, and we're taught what the texts are all about and that kind of thing. But very few courses are there that talk about actually how the religion interacted with people, with social groups as it went on. Now, why is this important? It's important because religion creates institutions. Any religion that has any kind of standing in a society will create its own institutions. What do I mean by this? These are places that involve social behavior. They involve, first of all, belief. What do you believe in? How should you behave? The ethics of behavior. And in the course of these institutions coming up, there are intersections of religious ideas and social activities, some of which may end up in dissent. And therefore you have points of dissent which emerge from these debates in religion, and sometimes the breakaways when in a religion, a group of people get together and say, we don't quite agree with this. And so you have a little discussion and sometimes there's a breakaway. Or alternatively, the other process is that the religion comes into contact with another religion. And in the course of talking about my religion and your religion, some people will emerge and say, well, it would be rather nice to put this idea together and perhaps make a new sect which picks on ideas from 2 different or 3 different religions. That also happens in history. So remember that as historians, when you're talking about the emergence of religious sects, you must analyze the sects and consider what are the different ways in which they were created and how did they come about. Now, dissent has many idioms in society. You can have dissent at many levels and it applies to all kinds of things. The clothes you wear, the food you eat, the books you read, and then later on, at a more sophisticated level, the thoughts you have and the discussions you have and so on. In my book, I chose to focus a little bit on religion, largely perhaps because the dissent in religion is more observable. It takes form, it gets created and it has a form and can be recognized as dissent more clearly. And therefore, in the course of discussing the continuities and histories of dissent, I have discussed a few examples. For instance, I begin with a discussion on Vedic Brahmanism, the religion of the Brahmins as explained in the Vedic texts, which is dominant and powerful. And it's from this religion, which is a religion that believes in deities, has particular gods that are worshipped, Mitra and Varuna to begin with, Indra and Agni, these are the major gods. There is a ritual of sacrifice. You express your worship through this very elaborate ritual in which you conduct a sacrifice. And so on. Now, this religion continues with the Brahmins for many, many centuries. But by the middle of the first millennium BC, I'm sorry, I'm old-fashioned. I talk about BC and AD, but you must remember that BC is BCE and AD is CE. By the middle of BCE, there's a new group of people that come up who question Vedic Brahmanism. That is a group that we call the Shramanas, the Buddhists, the Jains, the Ajivakas. There are varying degrees of agreement and disagreement among themselves and between them and Vedic Brahmanism. And this is quite interesting because obviously this was a time when we talk about the great intellectual movement of the mid-first millennium BC. This is what we mean, that there were groups of people that were constantly questioning, finding answers, projecting answers, seeking further answers, etc., etc. Very lively intellectual period. And in this varying degrees of agreement and disagreement, they're very clear, the Shramanas are very clear that they disagree with Vedic Brahmanism on basic points. They don't accept the existence of deities. When the Buddha is asked, his common reply is, we don't know, so why do we bother with them? They're irrelevant to our existence. We have other things to worry about. And they don't accept the ritual of sacrifice because many of these Shramana groups were strictly non-violent to start with. And the killing of animals as part of the sacrificial ritual was something that they could not accept. Therefore, Vedic Brahmanism refers to these groups as the Nastika those that do not believe, the non-believers. They're regarded as heretics, and they continue to be called Nastikas because they have a strong element of dissenting against Vedic Brahmanism right up till the 17th century. There are Sanskrit texts in the 17th century that describe them as Nastikas, non-believers. And in fact, in one of them, they list the Buddhists, the Jains, there are no Ajivakas, then they list the Charvak, and they list the Turushka as Nastika. The Turushka is the Turk. They don't say Musulman or Islam or anything, they say Turushka. It's really quite interesting. It's a Central Asian term. So there is this kind of disagreement, dissent, some would even say hostility. Sometimes the Shaivas and the Buddhist monks are really quite hostile to each other. But remember that in later periods, gradually, what begins as hostility gradually smoothens out a little bit, because the Buddhists, for example, have their own deities. The worship of Tara, which becomes a very important deity in Eastern India and in Tibet and so on. So there's a change within Buddhism to accepting to a partial degree what they had rejected many centuries earlier. And that is what I mean that, you know, one religion, when it meets another, sometimes concessions are made. But the hostility, for example, between the Shaivas and the Shramanas, the later hostility, that continues till quite late. Now, at one point in history, the Buddhists are dissenters, right? What I've just described. At a later point, that is the period from the Mauryas to the Guptas, when Buddhism is flourishing, it has terrific patronage. Ashoka, and Jainism has the patronage of Kharavela and so on. And it's everywhere, it has a presence. The great stupas are being built, and the viharas and the chaityas and so on. It's a very powerful religion at that point. It develops its own orthodoxy. And this very often happens. And it's quite interesting to see how a dissenting group gradually develops its own orthodoxy. And what happens with Buddhism is, first of all, you have a split between Hinayana, that claims to be the original teaching, and Mahayana, which then is treated as a later development. But what is also very interesting is that in this pattern, you have the emergence of orthodoxy and the emergence of dissent. Because remember that when both these two yanas, Hinayana and Mahayana, when they split into sects, and they split into multiple sects, as also do the Hindu religious sects, this is based on dissent. It is a group of monks who say, we don't agree with you in this ritual belief, or we don't agree with you in this monastic practice, and they go off on their own and form a new sect. So this kind of change is continually taking place. And in a sense, one of the fascinating things about looking at both orthodoxy and dissent in history is to see it as a continuing pattern. What is today dissent can perhaps become orthodoxy tomorrow, and that orthodoxy produces its own dissent, and that dissent becomes an orthodoxy, and so on. And so it's very interesting to look at these ideas in this way and see the pattern that emerges. So when the Buddhists become dominant, that is the Maurya to Gupta period, there are multiple sects, as I said, and they continue into the post-Gupta period until there is a slight decline in the following. Now, for this period, to give you very recent research. One of the questions that has been raised by historians, and it's a much debated question, but people are coming round to it somewhat, is that in this period from, let's say, the time of the Mauryas to the Guptas, roughly 400 BC to 400 AD, these 800 years, when the Shramana religions have a certain respectability and dominance and control society. And remember, of course, that the Shramana control on society was because of the institutions it set up, the major institution being the monastery. When you have a monastery and you recruit monks, and the teaching is carried out through the monastery, and the monks have to go into the settlement to get their daily food, there is contact between the teaching and the ordinary people. And so there's a lot of that going on at the same time. So the question that's being raised by a number of scholars now is that in this period of Shramana dominance, did the Shramana religions in any way influence Brahmanic teaching? And one of the issues that is being discussed in a number of articles these days is, for example, Vedic Brahmanism was not essentially a religion that underlined nonviolence. It couldn't, because its very ritual of worship involves the sacrificing of animals and so on. And there's a great deal of emphasis on fighting battles and success and, coming out as heroes and so on and so forth. Whereas the Shramana religions were continually talking about nonviolence. Now, whether or not people actually observed nonviolence, which is always a very debatable question. You may talk about an ethic and give it a lot of priority. The basic question is how many people are actually observing that ethic. Nevertheless, it gets publicity. And so you have various texts coming up at this time in which there is a discussion on nonviolence. You have the Bhagavad Gita, which discusses many things, but one of the things it does talk about is violence and nonviolence. You have the famous Shanti Parvan text of the Mahabharata, where when Yudhishthira is asked to take over kingship, he says, no, I don't want to be a king because it involves a lot of violence. And so the question that people are asking is, where did this debate come from? Was it just something that grew up on its own amongst all these people? Or was it a debate that was in the air? Were people talking about it? I mean, if you had Buddhist and Jain monks going out collecting their daily bread from the townspeople and talking to these people from whom they were getting their food, they must have been preaching these ideas. So were these ideas floating around, and do these texts then capture these ideas? And in all the texts, the Sanskrit texts written, composed by Brahmin authors, ultimately there is a defense of violence, provided it is in support of an ethical reason. I mean, there's no outright condemnation, but there is a conditioned defense, as it were. And so this is an argument that has been taken up by people who are saying, what was the general ambiance at the time, the social background against which all these discussions were happening? Now, what is happening to Hinduism in the first millennium AD, the first millennium CE, as you would say? There is a change to the worship of the Puranic deities. Mitra, Varuna, Agni, Indra are beginning to take a back seat, and Shiva and Vishnu come up to the front. And it is with these deities that you get the establishment after the Gupta period of a very strong and dominant type of Hinduism, which some scholars call Puranic Hinduism, because the texts that they're largely using Interestingly, not always the Vedic texts. They make they bow, as it were, to the Vedas, but they carry on then to talk about the Purans. They write their writings in the Purans, and the Purans are all texts that are dedicated to particular deities, and these are the deities. So the texts and the gods that are worshipped are different in Puranic Hinduism. The form of worship is different. Vedic Brahmanism was, worship was expressed through this very elaborate ritual of sacrifice, or even smaller domestic rituals, but there were these sacrificial rituals. Now you get, from the Gupta period onwards, a little earlier than the Gupta period, you get the coming in of icons, images of gods, which was something that didn't exist before. And from the Gupta period onwards, you begin to get temples. The temple is originally the house for the icon. It is the shrine, the single-roomed shrine in which the icon is placed for purposes of worship. And then as the patronage increases, more donations are made, more wealth comes in, this shrine, the single shrine, becomes the Garbhagriha, and then additional shrines are added till you get these huge temple complexes like the Chola temples of Tamil Nadu. So this has its own kind of history, which is a little different. What this sees, again, is the growth of multiple sects in Puranic Hinduism. Each deity has a sect, and each sect has a subsect, and so on and so forth. And the identity then very often is through the identity of the sect. The person will not say, I am a Hindu, he will say, I am a Pashupat Shaiv. That's very precise. That's exactly what the person is. And similarly with all the other sects as well. And the new deities that come up in Puranic Hinduism, the process is very, very interesting. For example, one is when the religion meets other religions. This was a period from the Mauryas onto the Guptas, also when Central Asia plays a big role in northwestern India. The coming of the Parthians, the coming of the Shakas, the coming of the Kushans, and so on. The Kushans in particular, based in Bactria, the Oxus Valley, and they come right up into North India, into the Middle Ganges Valley. Okay. So what do they bring? They do bring some deities. And it is thought, for example, this is a thesis that has been held for many, many hundreds of years by leading art historians, that the icon of Durga riding a lion goes back to a Bactrian goddess, Nana, riding a lion. Now, one can debate this thesis, but it's very interesting that there is this possibility of an actual icon that they might have inducted, brought into northern India, and converted into the icon of Durga. Otherwise, we know, of course, that deities can be made all the time. Before your lifetimes, I remember the making of a new deity in the last century called Santoshi Ma. Santoshi Ma was a goddess whose mythology was created, and she was created herself and given all kinds of an ancestry, and was worshipped as a goddess, having come out of, if I remember correctly, a bubble in the forehead of Ganesh or something of that kind. Now, the question that's very interesting for the historian is, why was a particular deity created at a particular historical moment? Whether it is Santoshi Ma in the 20th century or whether it is Durga in the 1st century AD, that is a very interesting historical question, because deities are created when people want to worship such deities. They aren't just created for the fun of it. there has to be a reason for the creation of the deity, as there was, for example, when the Santoshima was created. And not only just created, but there was a huge following as well in some parts of the country. I mean, I'm surprised that she's kind of gone out of popularity now, but I know in the late 20th century, she was extremely popular. But there we are. So you have the creation of a deity with the myth of origin, a temple to the worship of the deity, an icon of the deity, and the followers that become a sect. So you have a sect of the worshippers of Santoshima or whoever the deity may be. And then you have other religions that came in and much more deeply. For example, in about the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, there were 3 new religions. One was Zoroastrianism, the coming in of the Parsis, then Judaism, the coming in of Jewish traders from Cairo and the Mediterranean, and then Islam. Now, Islam, the coming of Islam is very interesting because we tend to treat it as a once and for all. And then the Muslim invaders came. You read this again and again in textbooks, one sentence. Actually, the coming is much more fascinating historically, because what do you get? You get, if you read the Sanskrit texts that refer to the coming of these people, they differentiate between the Yavanas, who are the Arabs, they're coming in from the West. All the people that came from the West, many of them are called Yavanas, including Queen Victoria in the 19th century. And those that come from Central Asia are separately called Turushka, Turk, Shaka, which goes back to a much earlier period, and so on. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the perception of this new religion coming in was less the religion, and it was much more the people who brought it. Those are the ones who are being referred to. Now the Arabs, they come in, they conquer Sindh, and they don't really do very much. There's very little of the conquest, the Arab conquest of Sindh, that survived. But the Arabs that came across the seas, the Arabian Sea, as traders and settled in Gujarat and then down the west coast, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Kerala, they are the ones that have left a stamp. And it's a stamp that we never refer to when we talk about the Muslims, because where they settled, they married locally and new religious groups emerged, partially Islamic, partially the local religion, generally some Hindu religion. So you have the Khojas and Bohras in Gujarat and in Maharashtra. You have the Navayats in the Konkan, the Mapilas in Kerala. Mixed, some Islamic, some not. But this is a totally different category from the Turushkas, who came as invaders into northwestern India and then finally settled down. And in that process of settling, there was yet another stream of Islamic type religion that came in, the Sufis. The Sufis, a few from Persia, mostly from Central Asia. They come in at that time as well. So the point that I'm trying to make is that when one talks about dissent and religion, do keep in mind the fact of how did this group come in, if it's an incoming group. You can't tar everybody with the same brush and say all Muslims came to India because they were invaders. There are some that came for very different reasons, and the end result, therefore, was also different. And one has to keep this in mind if one is being true to the historical profession. There is this result, which is very often a mixed form of religion, what you get. And that's the other thing that we need to study. We always study religions as solid evidence of this is what was believed in and this is what happened and so on and so forth. I think it's about time that we turned our focus a little bit and said, what are the mixtures that went into the making of all these different religious sects? It's quite revealing. It really is quite revealing. I mean, the little bit of work that I have done on 1 or 2 religious sects, it's absolutely fascinating to see what the mixtures are, what the components are that have come in. One of the interesting effects, for example, which we these days particularly don't talk about, is that when the Turks and Afghans came in, the Turushkas came into northern India and settled down and so on, some of them in the 16th century become Krishna Bhakts. They worship Krishna because Krishna Bhakti was the dominant religious sect in the whole area of Braj, where Braj was spoken, the area around Delhi and the Middle Ganges area. And so you have very well-established people from well-established Islamic families, such as Ras Khan and Abdul Rahim Khan-e-Khanan, who in fact were Krishna Bhakts, who composed dohas and verses in praise of Radha and Krishna. And these verses are still sung as bandishes in the Hindustani classical music tradition, although nobody realizes that in fact these authors, these poets, were the kinds of poets who were writing a lot of poetry in Hindi as well, a sign of their having settled down. Now, people like that, people like Abdul Rahim Khan, Khan-e-Khanan and Ras Khan, they were dissenters, and they were dissenters of 2 traditions. The mullahs, the Islamic tradition, the Orthodox Islamic tradition, which regarded them as renegades and didn't accept them, and the Brahmins, the strict Orthodox Brahmins, who also said that because they were born into Islamic families, they cannot be genuinely regarded as Christian Bhakts. So this is a rather complicated system of dissent, which also needs to be looked at. Now, Bhakti Hinduism, which emerges at this time in the early 2nd millennium CE, has a diversity of sects. To begin with, Vedic Brahmanism is not opposed, but it's kind of put aside. There's not too much emphasis given to Vedic Brahmanism. The emphasis is really much more to the deities that Puranic Hinduism threw up, and much more to Shaivism and to Vaishnavism, and particularly to the avatars of Vishnu, such as Ram and Krishna. These are very major foci of worship and identity. Each sant, each bhakti sant, worshipped one main deity as his deity in his or in her own way, depending on who he or she chose. They didn't necessarily follow any rules. Some rules maybe, but largely they made up their rules as they went along. And they were creating a new belief and ritual around the deity. This is very important, the newness of the belief and the ritual that didn't exist in the 1st millennium CE, but came into existence in the 2nd millennium CE. And therefore, there was, considering each one of these sants had their own structures and rules and forms of worship and so on, there was tremendous diversity. And it was geared to the region. The language used was the regional language. The forms of worship were very often also regional forms of worship. And then there was, in some cases, a much stronger dissent because there was a social message. If you look at the verses of sants like Kabir and Dadu and Ravidas, they are arguing for a different kind of society as well. Ravidas, for example, is very concerned about social equality, coming as he does from the avarna section of society, from the lower castes who were not given varna status. And the social message is, of course, beautifully put by Ravidas, who talks about the utopia to come, the society in the world to come, where people will live in a city which he calls Berampura, the city without sorrow. And this is really so beautifully expressed that it's very, very, very moving. And this kind of worship becomes very widespread. It spreads through singing local languages, people going from village to village, from town to town, and so on. It's much more of, to begin with at least, it's much more a kind of popular religious movement. And we have to recognize, therefore, what I'm trying to insist on is that dissent, in a way, is always present, to a larger or to a lesser degree, depending on what one is researching. And therefore, one can't push it aside. It may be there to a very small degree, or it may be there to a very large degree. But it is interesting to look for it and to see what it is telling you. And the big change that takes place, for example, in the late 19th and the 20th century, particularly, is when some of these moments of dissent become moments of protest. And the protest is, of course, the anti-colonial protest. And the anti-colonial protest then picks up, perhaps subconsciously, one hasn't really looked at this carefully enough, picks up some of these movements of dissent and brings them into the protest, the anti-colonial protest. The one that I have discussed in the book a little bit is Gandhi's Satyagraha, because I think that not so much his construction of what he calls Satyagraha, but much more the public response to his construction was because, in a sense, these ideas were floating ideas. They have been floating ideas in Indian history since 2,500 years or even more. So obviously someone who touches on those ideas will immediately have a response. And this is really the latter part of the book is a discussion of this public response and why I think it is so important. It was a form of dissent using older practices in a modern situation. And in a sense, again, historically, there are always people using older practices in that current situation. And they become part of the older tradition. And then we come along and we pick them out and we start using them as well. And we are using older practices. And this is another rather fascinating aspect of the study. So let me conclude then by talking about saying a little bit about what I regard as the characteristics of dissent, other than the definition that I started with. As I said, it has an objective. Dissent has to have an objective. This is very important. And in many cases, it is directed towards a program of social welfare and social justice. There is very often an element of this. I mean, even in the Shramana tradition, there was an element of really opposing upper caste ideas, practices, although to begin with, the major support for Buddhism and Jainism did come from many of the upper castes. It's not as if they were excluded. But nevertheless, there was a consciousness that there has to be a certain degree of social justice. It's not just returning to a period of the ancient past, which is made up of all kinds of fantasies. It is returning to a period of the ancient past with a purpose in mind. And we have to be aware as historians as to what is the purpose. It is, again, essentially non-violent, as Gandhi's movement was. And very important, and this is what distinguishes it from many of the smaller movements that claim to be dissenting movements or claim to be the movements of progress today. It is inclusive. Everybody and anybody is included in. They all come together and are treated as equal participants in what is going on. And this is, of course, very different from some of the political movements based on religion, which highlight a particular religion, be it Islam or be it Hinduism or what. It's terribly important to realize that these dissenting movements, and particularly movements like the Satyagraha, are movements which are inclusive movements and include everybody. And finally, I would say that I think the importance of looking at dissent is because, after all, we are at a turning point in our history. We are at the moment discussing a new secular democratic society, or hopefully we're discussing this. And if we are discussing this, we must understand not just the secular and the democratic, but we must understand why there was this undercurrent of dissent in many thought processes in the past. Thank you. That's all I have to say.